Well, once again, as we continue our study of the Lifelight program, we now continue with the book of Hebrews, and we will be looking at the first full two chapters this time with Hebrews 1, verse 1 through chapter 2, verse 18. The book of Hebrews is a rather different document. As you probably know by now, in ancient times, it was thought, particularly by people in Alexandria down in Egypt, that Paul had written it. And when one looks at the Greek, one recognizes that it's not the same kind of style that Paul uses elsewhere. It's a much more difficult Greek to read. And so some have thought that others connected with Paul would have written this. If we look very carefully, we recognize that in the book of Hebrews there's a lot about sacrifice, a lot about the various kinds of sacrificial systems that were involved in Israel, and oddly enough, except quite toward the end, there's only one mention of the word resurrection in the entire letter to the Hebrews. The book also includes many, many quotes from various parts of the Hebrew Scriptures, what we call the Old Testament, and we need to examine those at least in some detail to understand what this writer is trying to get at. The letter to the Hebrews is one that in many ways is very, very majestic. I would say if I had to pick the books where Jesus is described as the most majestic in the New Testament, the Gospel of John, the letter of Paul to the Colossians, and the book of Hebrews would win hands down. Because in each of these we get to stand way back and we get to look at our Lord from the focus of His reign, His rule even now. Many of the other writings talk about our Lord's suffering and His death and even His resurrection. But these three books particularly look at where is Jesus now. We're in the part of the Apostles' Creed that says He is seated at the right hand of the Father. And as we begin with the first couple chapters of Hebrews, we note that there are many terms and identifications by which Jesus is identified. And it's sort of difficult, but what we have to do is sort of ask the question, if this is said, if these things are talked about, what's the problem that is being addressed? And we'll notice very early on in the book of Hebrews that the word angels comes up very often. We also live in a world where people are interested in the higher powers, the higher beings. And if someone can be in tune with the higher beings or higher powers, then they might feel like they have more control over the world around them. In the ancient world, of course, the people thought that there were all sorts of gods, deities, not maybe that they called them all angels, but deities or powers that people looked to because their world was so chaotic. They noted that there were so many times when things didn't work the way they wanted them to. And so there was a desire on the part of people to try to get some way to have control over the ups and downs of their life. One way that some people looked to was to be in some sort of relationship with the higher powers. And in the Jewish circles, one would have looked not just to human beings or even the priestly family, but would have looked to angels. To set a little bit of the background for this, of course, we don't know from Genesis 1 when the angels were created. We are told that God made beings that to us are invisible, and we might think that these unseen creatures are much more important and higher than we are. And we might think that if we can simply get the angels on our side or find our guardian angel and do whatever is necessary to get our help from that guardian angel, then we'll be protected from some troubles. In the Old Testament time, we remember that God often spoke. And as the end of the Old Testament era came along, people began to wonder, now how could God speak and yet not destroy the people? And there was a Jewish tradition that sprang up that said between God and the people, even though it wasn't always said, there were angels, angelic beings or messengers who delivered the messages for God so that God was not seen directly. And by the time of Jesus, there was a very long-standing Jewish tradition that the angels were what we would call the intermediaries between God and human beings. We see some evidence of that in the Old Testament stories. For example, the story of Isaac, where an angel stops Abraham from killing Isaac. And we see that in the story of Gideon, where his father and mother hear about an angelic being, Samson as well. And so a variety of places where these angelic beings show up. I guess I should not misspeak myself. It's not the Gideon story, but the Samson story, where an angel comes to Samson's mother and talks to her. The other stories about which Gideon is only one example would be the idea that the angelic beings, the hosts or the armies, went with the Israelites into battle when they were fighting against their foes. And so we find that when Joshua comes into the land of promise, he sees a man in a human form, and he says, "Who are you?" And he said, "I'm the head of the armies of those who fight for the living God." And so there were times when the people thought of the angels as delivering messages from God, much like a prophet would, and times when the angelic beings were the hosts or the armies that would go and fight for God on behalf of his people. You would think that if you wanted to find any kind of power, that you would look for a power in one of those higher beings. Something is going on within the account that is in back of the book of Hebrews that sort of intimates that the people thought that the angels were higher beings and powers, and that if you wanted to look for a source of strength, you'd look there and not to any human being. And so the book of Hebrews has to deal with a question. How can Jesus, one who was to all visible intents and purposes a human being, actually be greater than all of the great things of the past? Greater than the angels, greater than the high priest, greater than all the sacrifices, greater than Passover, greater than the Day of Atonement, greater than all the things that one might find within the Old Testament story. And one view that I have found very helpful in trying to understand the book of Hebrews is a view by F.F. Bruce, who says that it is very possible that this letter was written to those Jews of the diaspora, of the dispersion, maybe from the priestly family, even though they weren't living near the temple, who had become Christian. And they're struggling now. They're struggling because there are persecutions, there are troubles coming, and they might have said to themselves, we are being punished because we denied our role as children of Aaron and became Christians. Maybe we ought to quit and give up on this, and maybe we ought to go back to our old ways. Many of the Old Testament books talk about how the people went back to the old way of thinking that they used to have. And so the book of Hebrews begins, this letter begins with an account of who Jesus is. And he is called, among the other identifications, he is called the Son of God, not just in the human sense, but in the sense that the king had once been called the Son, taken up into a special place of honor. He's called the heir, the one who inherits everything from the Father. He's called the Creator, something that we see also in John and in Colossians, that Jesus is the one who made all this. He is not simply part of the creation, he's the Creator who made it and somehow became part of this human nature. He reflects the glory of God. He is the one who, if you want to know who God is, not just an angel, but if you want to know who God is, look at Jesus. Watch who he is, watch what he does, and then you'll know the heart of God. If you see things about Jesus that upon reflection you find very distasteful, his love for sinners, then recognize that your heart is being examined because he reflects the glory, the love of the Almighty God. He is the imprint of God, sort of like the footprint or the image, or if you want to know who God is, just look at the picture of Jesus' life and you will see that. He is the one who sustains, who bears up as God bears up. He is the one who purifies all. And so as we get into some of the priestly terminology, we find this is the one who cleanses, who gets rid of all the dirt and all of the filth. But already in the very beginning, a very interesting comment is made. Jesus is the one who sat down at the right hand of the Father. Servants never sit in the presence of their master. They may lay down with their face to the ground, putting themselves in a position where they can be killed if their master does not love them. Or they may stand in a role of service, but they never sit down right next to the one whom they serve. And so right off the bat, the writer to the Hebrews says Jesus is greater than those, for example, like the high priest who stood when they served God, or greater than the angels. And so once again, we have to try to understand, how can somebody worship as true God one who was hung on a cross and died? Using the priestly terminology, the priest, or the writer of this, is going to write to priests and those connected with worship and say, he is the one sacrifice that ends all sacrifices. He is the one who hung on a cross as a sacrifice, as a means of saying to God how desperately sorry all humans are for what they have done wrong. When Jesus hung on the cross, he was saying to his own Father, I, on behalf of every human being, express the deep sorrow and put myself before you as one who is unworthy, so that that offering, that sacrifice, was seen as sufficient for every other human being, whether or not they know it, whether or not they're aware of that. It's already been done. It's already been taken care of. And so Jesus is described as one who is much more than an angel, that he is in a relationship with God as Father to Son, one who is called the firstborn of all the creation. And there are some hints of Proverbs chapter 8 here as the wisdom which was created at the very beginning, and Jesus is often called the wisdom. Something to say, just because we saw him here on earth doesn't mean that he isn't more than that. He is truly as close to God as one can get. And thus, if one is going to be trying to say, do I believe this or not, do I want to believe this, one has to reckon with the fact this is God himself on earth. And what we see him do is God's action on behalf of human beings. And so there is a comparison then that says, well, yes, there were angels, but the angels were nothing more than messengers, and the Son is the one who gets to sit on the throne, bringing righteousness and bringing every gift that God has to bring. An angel cannot bring godly gifts. There's almost a hint already here that humans are even more important, even more precious and special to God than the angelic beings. And we might reflect on this for a minute. There seems to be no story in the Bible that says God was willing to suffer and die for Satan and the angelic beings who rebelled. They were cast out of God's presence, and that was the end of it. But for human beings, there is a way in which salvation is still offered. God hungers that much to have a relationship with us that he will go to every extent to suffer and die, to be that sacrifice for every one of us. And so Jesus is the one who loves righteousness. That was what the priests taught, to love everything that is right, to know what God is helping you to do, and then love to do that, yearn to do that. And as we see Jesus' life then, that he yearned to go to whatever extent was necessary to serve his Father. He wasn't saying, this is not part of my lifestyle, this is not something important to me. But he said, Father, you shaped my ideas so I can understand what I can do for you and what is right for you. That's what I will do. And so the story in Hebrews goes on to say the Lord remains. He has not just simply disappeared. Even though the heavens will perish, the form of this world is going to pass away, he is still seated at the right hand of the Father, and he will never pass away. So angels are seen as merely servants who bring about some of the benefits of telling the story about salvation, but who finally, even though they might go forth into battle in the Old Testament, even though they might be there fighting against the enemies of Israel in the Sinai and as they go in the land of promise, no angel can hang on a cross. No angel can become human. And the one who did had even greater power than the angels, and puts the angels really, no matter what good purpose they serve before God, into their place. And so we continue with chapter 2 then, and we recognize the tension that's there. Because these people were saying, oh, maybe this Jesus is only a man, they were drifting. They were tempted to drift away to say, this really doesn't make any difference. And we all know that if we haven't heard the story for a while, we can begin to downplay the importance of Jesus and his death and his resurrection. And we're told that the Old Testament, there was a valid place for the angels to serve, but if you want to know God at his fullest, then look at Christ, one who is far above all of the angels, and that his power to do something for our benefit is considered valid by God. And so we are told then that Jesus was not subject to the angels, but that he was one who through miracles and gifts came to be in a lower position for a time so that he could bring all of us back to that elevated position that we once had. The book of Hebrews says that the old covenant, good as it was to restrain the sinners and to guide them in seeking to love and serve God, could never really fix the root problem, the heart problem, and so it was Jesus himself who had to do that. And so even though Jesus was once lower than God, the answer is not, well, where is he now? We don't see him anymore, so why should we believe in him? But the answer is to be found in the fact that this writer says he is now elevated through his ascension and what they call the session, the being seated at the right hand, that he is now ruling in power over the entire universe. And so the idea of being seated at the right hand is not sort of a local sense where he's located sitting right next to his Father. The right hand person for the king was the one who carried out the king's will all throughout the world. And so what this means is that Jesus is the one who, truly a human being and truly God, is carrying out the Father's will on this earth. This world is not in charge of just human beings, not fallen human beings. It's in charge of the one true God and true man who suffered and died and rose and ascended and is now directing this world so that nothing happens apart from his will, and none of those who believe are going to be lost. And so this one who once was lower, now where did he go? He is elevated to the position of being the highest human being. Now if Paul were writing, he would have probably said at this point, he is the one living out the resurrection of the dead. He is the firstborn of those who have fallen asleep. Here it does not use the word resurrection at this point. But that the grace of God, the undeserved love of God, was such that God took Jesus' death and said that's enough to make sure that everyone's death has been punished, that the deliverance from the power of that death can come, so that where Jesus is seated at the right hand of God is where humans one day will be as well. Now, what happens is when we look at it from that perspective, then looking back into this world, even if this world has some troubles with it, the writer to the Hebrews says, don't worry that this is the end of it all. There is something for those who are believers where that grace of God will carry them on into eternity. That's what I've talked about as having that tomb vision, where we look out of the tomb into our eternity and shape today on the basis of the fact that even though physically we will die, that we're going to live forever and we will reign with Christ. And so we are told that we will also be brought to glory by the one who is the pioneer and perfecter of the faith. Now the pioneer is our pioneers are the ones who went out into the Wild West and first settled it and first broke that sod and cleared all those forests wherever they found those in the northern part of the country and established a place to live. Jesus as the pioneer, the one who goes before us, the one who does the hard work, here the work of suffering and dying and rising. And so we're told that we've been made holy by him. So the good news comes out right away. There's a hint of, you might be wondering about this, but then the good news comes. He has given you the benefits of his own sacrifice, and as God treated his people as holy, so we also can hear that he treats us as people who have been brought from death to life and who are made holy. And because he is the one who destroys death and frees us from the power of that, then we also know that he who went into the realm of Satan and came forth from it will help us, so that in all the times when we are tempted, he will be with us there He'll pull us back from the temptation. He'll deliver us from the power of it. And He will help us in all the tests that we go through. So chapter 1 points out that Jesus is truly God and not simply an angelic messenger and not simply a priest, though that we'll see much more on later. And chapter 2 says, now looking to Him, the pioneer and perfecter, don't lose heart, don't give up, don't drift away from the faith. Recognize that what you might think of as disinterest is really Satan trying to grab hold of you, wreck the joy of the good news, and bring you back into his realm. So the troubles and struggles of believing and acting on the faith are seen as tests that come from Satan, who tries to divert our attention, but we are called to direct our attention to the Lord and then say to Him, whatever you've made us to do, please help us to do that. Help us to hunger as you hungered to do your Father's will, that we would as well. I thank you as you join together with me in worship of the book of Hebrews, or study of the book of Hebrews. This book, which deals with the worship life of the people and how people are called to turn their eyes toward the Lord, will be one that will bring all of us great blessing. I thank you all for your interest and for coming, and I ask God's continued blessings upon you. Thank you.